Right, good afternoon everybody. My name is Andy Cameron-Smith, Editorial Director at Unlock Net Zero, and I'm just chairing the forum stage for this afternoon. So a big thank you for joining us for this session. Over the next 45 minutes we're going to be hearing how the public sector is fostering a promising future for the built environment as they share best practices in city planning, contracting and public-private funding. We're joined by an esteemed panel this afternoon, which includes Councillor Richard Clewer from Wiltshire Council, Mike Hakata from the London Borough of Haringey, Catherine McGuinness from the Connected Places Catapult and the City of London Corporation, and Peter Runacres from the Earls Development Company. If you've been in the sessions already, you know we're taking questions via Slido, so when you get to it, it is the code #IZ24 and then select the Built Environment Forum room, and the question will come through to here where Chris, the moderator, will be able to ask that on your behalf. So, without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to your moderator for this session, who is Christopher Hammond, the Chief Executive of UK 100. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Oh, it's very strange having myself whispering in my ear. There we go. How do you feel? Okay, so we've heard about the range of speakers that we've got here today. So I'll start just by introducing myself. My name's Chris Hammond, Chief Exec of UK 100. We're a coalition of councils from across the country, from both urban and rural environments, crossing all different political parties, who want to accelerate that local net zero delivery. We are far too centralised as a country. Too much power is in Westminster and Whitehall, and what we want to do is to empower our leaders, our councils and our communities to drive forward that transition. If we do have a localised transition to net zero, it's going to be able to be achieved cheaper, faster and better. And there's more likely to be a longer legacy as things stick, and that we involve our communities and they can actually be brought in rather than something being imposed of them. So as an organisation, what we do is we work with our leaders to help that and support that delivery, but also we advocate for their powers and the financing to make local net zero a reality. So this session is a really interesting session because it looks at the relationship between the public and the private sector. So there have been some fantastic examples and there's been some really difficult examples and challenges in bringing together in the built environment as we move towards net zero. If we think about just one aspect of the built environment around retrofit, we're going to need hundreds of billions of pounds and 20 million homes to be retrofitted. That is going to be a significant challenge, and it can't be all private or public money. So we need to have a genuine partnership to tackle just that one aspect of the built environment. Our homes and buildings account for around 25% of emissions, so it is a significant sector that we need to decarbonise together. And as they say, an Englishman's home is his castle. So if we're going into people's homes and we're looking at that retrofit, then there's going to be significant pushback, and people are going to want to say about how these schemes are rolled out. So these are some of the challenges that we have to work with. Now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So we've got Peter Runacres, who's Head of Urban Futures at the Earls Development Company, a significant regeneration project in London, cutting across commercial, house building, and some really interesting challenges. So Peter's reflections on what some of those opportunities working with local government and also what the private sector wants to see from its partners. So Peter, over to you.
Can everybody hear me okay? Good, okay. So what would we like to see? That's a really, really challenging question. We'd like to see, I think, consistency across the board. I think we talked about it previously. One of the things that we find quite frustrating is the disparity between policy, regulations and the planning requirements. So to give you a good example, I've talked about it a lot just recently, but we want to increase the urban greening. We want to increase the biodiversity net gain. But if you want to green buildings and you actually want to put green roofs, you want to put greening on terraces or the outsides of buildings, there are conflicting regulations. The fire brigades are really unhappy with putting greening on the outside of buildings because they see it as a fire risk. So how do you actually counter those two things? So there are, and again, when you're looking at trying to do residential development and you're looking at the cross-fighting issues of planning requirements in terms of the amount of affordable compared to then trying to achieve passive house principles of Part O, Part L, all of these things actually start to compete. And when you layer in recent, desires for dual aspect for, sensibly in a post-Grenfell world, looking at dual staircases within residential, all of these things combine to make the world of development. I know I'm not sounding like a bleating developer here, but it actually just makes it really challenging when in the last 24 months construction costs have gone up by over 16% on average. So actually the world of development, when we are trying to decarbonise from an operational energy, but more importantly from an embodied carbon perspective, which nobody seems to be talking about. Most local authorities refer to certain standards. They ask you to achieve set carbon targets in terms of the overall whole life cycle costing, but there's no support for how you can actually achieve the low embodied carbon targets, which actually is our net present issue. As a nation, we're going to hit our operational net zero targets fairly quickly. We've got ways of doing that. We're working with 2 local authorities of differing colours. We've got one red and one blue in Hammersmith and Fulham, in Kensington and Chelsea. And they're working with us jointly on a joint energy sharing network. So it is great to actually have local authorities of any persuasion working together across common issues. Why can't we get them to work together on the bigger issues like embodied carbon, and I would love to see some initiatives from central and local governments in terms of trying to support their really hard issues in terms of how we abate those really difficult areas like embodied carbon and how we might achieve the circular economy. But there is hope on the horizon, I would say. The 2 areas where we have got both boroughs to actually talk at the same time is in the environment and in the energy. So I'm really, really hopeful that we can actually start to take things forward. But I do think there is a role for central government. I know you were quite keen on, and I get that in terms of pushing it down, but actually making sure that we have consistency across the board and that they understand those cross-correlating issues and not leave it entirely to the private sector to sort out what are the priorities that you actually want to hit. It seems that isn't, nobody seems to come at it from a consistent approach. Nobody looks at the bigger picture. It's all still quite siloed in terms of issues. Is that enough of a challenge?
I think it's enough to get us going with. Thank you, Peter. So, Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you. So the other 3 panellists that we have here today are all elected politicians in 3 very different areas. So outnumbering Peter, our private sector representatives on the panel. But the first one I'm going to introduce is Catherine McGuinness, CBE, who is the Non-Executive Director of Connected Places Catapult and former Policy Chair of the City of London Corporation. Catherine.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually going to speak half through the perspective of the private sector, but I'm going to speak on the basis of some work I've recently been doing with the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, 3CI, on speaking with the private sector about how we can unlock the finance that we absolutely need. Because we know, as you've said, Chris, how very much is needed, and we know that can't come from the public sector alone. There need to be new models developed to unlock the funding from the private sector too. Now, 3CI is another coalition of local authorities across the country now representing basically really the largest number, or the majority of local authorities, working in partnership with the private sector on exactly this question: how can they unlock finance, how can they move towards net zero? It was set up just before the Glasgow COP, and it has made significant and rapid progress. It's also grown enormously from a small number of sponsors to where it is now. The work that it does includes a national net zero pipeline, where we look at the projects which authorities may have in their area, and we've discovered, I mean, there are many more, but we've developed the pipeline of 1,100 projects worth over £60 billion across the country. We're moving from a pipeline to prospectus. We have a prospectus of these opportunities, which we're now helping to develop to investor proposition. We've created a net zero neighbourhood model, which is looking at exactly that challenge of how you retrofit houses in an affordable way, whilst reducing public subsidy. And I took that model to the private sector to see what they thought of it and what they thought of the wider ecosystem. Now, what the private sector said to me was they absolutely endorsed a place-based approach, working with local areas and local leaders on projects in their area. And I'll come back to that in a second because of the importance of that. They absolutely stressed the need to develop new models of financing because the old models will not quite work. They endorsed our view that we need demonstrators and pilots. We came to the view that we need a better single national conversation about what's happening and what might work, because lots of different bodies, councils, investors are developing thoughts and models and opportunities and trying some of them out, but they're not necessarily sharing what they're thinking and what they're discovering with each other. So we think that there is a need for an ongoing conversation where we can bring together learnings, we can look at what's working, and we can try to build on that to create the final base that they said was absolutely necessary, which was a stronger enabling environment, and an environment which looks at the regulation, which looks at the planning rules, which looks at the whole raft of other issues which may be preventing development, preventing progress. Why place leaders are really critically important is because our investors said to us that whatever else they had in an area, unless they could be guaranteed some form of community buy-in, they would be reluctant to invest at scale in local projects. And local community leaders, council leaders, councils can do so much, not only in helping with public understanding and support, but also in some of those issues that might be blocking the supply chain, whether it's looking at the skills that are needed in your particular area. Let me give a shout out for the City of London and its initiative on skills for a sustainable skyline, where it's working with some of its businesses. Obviously, they're slightly different from some of the other businesses one may have, but they're looking at what green skills need to be developed and what greater workforce needs to be unlocked. But that's just one example of how local place leaders can look at the wider picture and work with investors to try to see delivery. So I think that's what I'll say for the moment. So Chris, hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Now I'm going to move on to Councillor Mike Hakata, Cabinet Member for Climate Action, Environment and Transport, and also Deputy Leader of Haringey Council, and is also a UK 100 Climate Leadership Academy graduate. Mike.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay, I actually put together quite a lot of notes, which I've realised will probably take more than an hour to read out. So I'll try and get through them in a breakneck speed and edit it as I go along. But I don't think I need to repeat it here that local authorities, councils across the country are a absolutely critical aspect of delivering on net zero in this country. And elsewhere. Obviously, we're talking sustainable travel, we're talking renewable energy, biodiversity protection, and retrofitting, as you mentioned. And there are multiple co-benefits, and I think this is really important in terms of the reasons why we're doing it and the reasons how we can communicate with communities. It's not simply about the big question of climate, but actually it's also about jobs, it's about reducing fuel poverty, about reducing inequalities, improving health, etc. And all of those things come together as for the key sort of driver for the reason to create the partnerships. And the key partnerships are between central government, local government, the community and third sector, and the private sector. Just to give you some examples of what we've been doing in the projects that we've been undertaking in Haringey. So retrofitting has obviously been a key aspect of this, and that was mentioned at the start. We invested of our own money 101 million, which we used for a retrofit program to essentially retrofit all of our social housing between now and 2035. That works out about 1,500 homes a year. Now we put that money into that pot. It's a £400 million project, but we needed that money, if you like, put our money where our mouth is, so that we're leveraging that and being able to sort of to crowd in public sector money, but also private sector money. And you know, the benefits of that, remembering that 50% of our emissions in the borough come from housing. We have a large social housing stock in Haringey as well. That works out about 17% of our emissions. So addressing that has a huge impact, but it also has social justice impacts and addressing inequalities. Part of that, though, what we've realised is that skills and jobs have to be a part of that. So we've started an Overcoming Barriers to Retrofit programme, where we're upskilling local SMEs for retrofit in partnership with a Retrofit Works, which is a cooperative of retrofit organisations, and Parity Projects, which is a consultancy, and working with the local further education academy, it's called the Green Academy, and it's all about ensuring that SMEs and local, we've got 8,600 unemployed in the borough, making sure that there is a track through this for them to find work as well. In terms of urban mobility, something that's incredibly important in terms of bringing down sustainable travel. We've invested in low traffic neighbourhoods, 2.5 square miles of low traffic neighbourhoods and 34 school streets to date. And we've also just gone into an agreement with 2 dockless bike companies, and we've seen tens of thousands of journeys within the first couple of months of that. We're also working with community energy to develop renewable energy within the borough, and community energy, we believe, will be absolutely key to that, but also looking, because it is quite a challenge to produce renewable energy in an urban environment. But we're looking at, for instance, developing a solar array on the Banbury Reservoir, which is on the borders of Tottenham. And then, crucially, planning policy is absolutely essential, and that was mentioned earlier. We're at the moment developing our local plans, and embodied carbon is something that we are exploring, and how we can do that. And I think it'll be really good for our officers to speak to you about how we achieve that. But we're also looking at high demands stipulations on biodiversity net gain, and looking at whole life cycle emissions, and but also, I think, and this is very important, is what we need from government. And I've put here that we need statutory net zero duties for councils. I think which are then followed by funding, which enables us to be able to actually deliver based on funding that comes from those stipulations. And I think to finish, just to say that urban councils face big challenges to deliver net zero, from costs and skill gaps to finance and policy barriers. But by sharing knowledge, by building partnerships across all the sectors, we believe that we can achieve net zero.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. And now introducing Councillor Richard Clewer, Leader of Wiltshire Council, Chair of the Countryside Climate Network and UK 100's Co-President, also representing a very rural authority, so different challenges to this puzzle.
Yes, a very different place, a very different set of challenges. What do we need? If I start by coming back to Peter's point. We need consistency. We need consistency on all sides. Yeah, I know I've just said politicians need to be consistent, not over the course of a single parliament, but between parties and over a 15, 20-year period. But we need that. It's why I spend any bit of free time I can trying to help with UK 100, because we bridge that party divide. We don't care. It's about decarbonisation. And that consistency is absolutely critical. And without it, I really struggle to see how meaningful progress with the private sector can be made. Because if you're from the private sector and you want to invest, that investment has got to come over a reasonable time period with a proper return. And to get that, you need consistent policy. What does that mean with the built environment? Well, if you start with planning policy, national building regulations, start there. We need building regulations that are forward-thinking. I will bore Chris by making the point again, but it is institutional insanity that we are still building houses today that will need retrofitting in 5-10 years' time at a cost of $20,000 per property. That lack of consistency, that doesn't give any incentive to the good investors out there, the organisations that are actually wanting to put money into meaningfully tackle these issues, but also making a return at the same time. Local policy, we need consistency there, but it can't be dictated by government, because Mike and I want to achieve exactly the same thing. We want to hit zero carbon as soon as we can, but your issues are far more based around housing. I have a comparatively affluent, retired body of house owners who are doing a pretty good job of decarbonising their own properties over time. So I've got significantly less housing stock than you do. I'm doing 100 properties, well, a few more than 100 a year, but we're gearing up to maybe 500 a year for decarbonisation. So it's a different set of challenges. But transport, I have no way forward of decarbonising transport in Wiltshire, because according to government, 75% of my population live in villages. Don't tell the people of Marlborough they're a village, but government defines them as a village. So a hugely different set of challenges. And I think that, I personally think that good government is where you get that consistent direction. You say, this is where we've got to go, this is where we're going, and then you don't dictate the route to get there. So you don't make planning policy that's being developed in London apply to Wiltshire, because it won't work. Equally, you don't make vehicular decarbonisation in Wiltshire apply to London, because public transport's functional in London. It isn't in Wiltshire. So that overarching consistency backed up with a trust to say to councils and business and people, decarbonise, but you work out how you get there best for your own areas. What do we need from industry? Honestly, I'd like some more responsibility from some of them. I've got a local plan going through, Reg 19, it's gone through its Reg 19 consultation, and I have got a huge pushback from developers against the viability of building zero carbon housing. Now, there is no logical argument I can come up with not to build zero carbon housing for all new housing right now. I've put it into the local plan, I'm copying other councils that have got that through, but there's huge pushback, and other councils have had that kicked out at local plan stage because developers are saying, no, we need the profit margin now. So business has got to give us a more consistent long-term approach to meet our challenges and our requirements as well. And if we can find that balance, the balance that isn't just about maximising profit, but is balancing that social need that we're driving for, and making sure there is profit there in the process, I think that's where we actually achieve the sweet spot where we can deliver. And it's a really tough one to get to right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, for your opening remarks. I'm now going to take the stroll over to the Slido to get the questions. To get the questions that you guys have put in. And if I can't get this to work, I may dispatch somebody with a microphone. So we heard from the panel for a range of different perspectives around what businesses are looking for, around that clarity. We heard about place-based approaches. We heard about the certainty, making sure that what is committed to, what is in our strategies is followed through. And we need that stability and that consistency, which is going to be key. And what local authorities are looking for, we've heard about the social value, we've heard about some of those sticky challenges that Mike talked about in Haringey, but we've also talked about the need for those long-term partners and that longevity. and, as Richard said at the end, sharing some of that risk and reward. It's got to be a coterminous relationship. So, now just looking at some of the Slido questions. Some have been upvoted, so I'll look at those and I'll point to different people in the panel as we come to them. So, how can you be sure that retrofitting is effective in the long term? A major UK study of 55,000 renovations says no. That's from Johnny. Peter, I'm going to come to you as a builder. How do you think retrofit can be effective?
It's a little bit difficult for us because we're actually not a regen site, we're a new development. So we are a large brownfield site. But on both sides of us, we have two boroughs that have a massive variation in terms of the existing housing stock. Both boroughs have massive retrofit programs. And actually, I think you kind of got to look at it from a strategic perspective. So both boroughs have started looking at it from an energy perspective to kind of help people themselves in terms of that fuel poverty, tying in with us. So we're putting in a low temperature ambient loop district network, which will be zero operational carbon from day one. We should be operational energy positive. So what we are working with is so we can work with both boroughs so that we can actually export that energy to the boroughs, actually helping take some of the, if you forgive the pun, heat off of them so they can focus on longer term retrofit issues. I think we do need to grasp the nettle at some point over some of the housing stock, that if you look at the embodied carbon requirements for it and the energy requirements and the challenges of achieving net zero, some of the housing stock probably, this is going to get me in, this is a personal view, not one of ECDC's, some of it isn't actually worth retaining and would be better and could be more lower embodied carbon if we actually built with newer techniques and newer materials. So I think that at some point some local authorities and some central governments they're going to need to start to address that nettle. Whether it is better in the long term, you almost have to do it on a case-by-case basis. We're spending a lot of money on doing a lot of analysis of the existing stock that we've got on site, which isn't much, to see what we can keep, what we can reuse and what we can repurpose. So I do think the GLA's pathway in terms of building use and retention is actually a very good one. I don't know how widely that's been spread, but that's actually really good. So I think it can be viable, but I would always question whether you absolutely have to right at the end. And actually, if you're looking at, as Richard says, 50, 60 years down the line, are the measures that you're taking now actually viable in terms of the embodied carbon? So putting in 3 times the amount of roof insulation is completely nuts, because you'll never get the return in the embodied carbon over its life. So I think there's sometimes people just throw things, responses at the built environment issues, and they don't think about the long-term solutions.
Thank you, Peter. And we've got 3 councils here that have all taken kind of a long-term approach to their retrofit programs. So be keen to hear from some of you about that concern about that long-term investments and if it's effective. I'll go with Richard and then I'll come to Mike and Catherine.
Really quickly, the first thing we did when we started our council house retrofitting was take 2 properties of the 2 most common types to retrofit them to actually demonstrate whether it would be cost effective and whether it would work or not. If you can't do that and can't show your tenants those properties to say it costs £400 a year less to run this one, or give them the evidence of once it's been running for a while, you're not going to convince them. These are not people who care a great deal about carbon reduction. They care about where their next paycheck is coming from and where the next meal is coming from. So you've got to evidence it. And that evidence means you've really got to be analytical with everything you do. You've got to break it all down. You've got to break your housing types down. You've got to work out what will be required, which 200 properties are honestly going to have to be demolished to ever get them to an EPC of anything, which you can use government money to kickstart the program. And in that, you've also, in my view, got to take a fabric first approach. Just sticking solar panels on things doesn't work. You've got to start with the fabric of the building as far as you can, which in my case involves, strangely enough, robots crawling around other floor spaces spraying foam, which I never thought we'd have with retrofit.
There's so much to unpack there, but I think one of the key aspects of this is who is it working for, and what are we trying to achieve? And if I talk about our social housing stock, a lot of it has uninsulated solid walls. Because of those, they have damp problems. There are health issues that are related to those. There are obviously fuel poverty issues related to those. So there are issues in the here and now that are social issues that we need to deal with in our social housing stock. Now, our approach has been similar. Is to look at archetypes and to model archetypes and look at climate risk models on top of that. So to actually go, okay, what are the worst case scenarios in terms of heating, in terms of flooding, in terms of all of these kind of things going forward, and to build accordingly. But I think exactly that, we go for the worst first and fabric first to ensure that actually that it's sealed and it's safe. And then look at all of the other additions, such as renewable energy, removing the gas cookers and etc. And I think there's certainly a lot of work that modelling has to play an important part in it in terms of long-term forecasting. And there will be some buildings that will not actually be up to scratch, but I would say because we're taking a worst first approach, because that's essentially to deal with inequalities, we would still retrofit those buildings even if the long-term solution is going to be something different.
And what I'd say from my perspective, I am a City of London councillor, but I'm a backbencher very much these days, so I'm not a spokesperson for the city. We are looking at retrofit in planning policies within the city, and looking at where materials and so on can be reused rather than particularly new brought in. But what I will move to is why we were looking at retrofit, particularly when we were looking at the net zero neighbourhoods model, which 3CI has developed, and which I was kicking the tyres on with the finance sector. But we looked at retrofit because we know that domestic emissions make up a very significant element of the emissions of the country at the moment that we need to be tackling. Will what is being done work in the long term? Well, you need to keep looking at the data. Some mistakes will be made. Some mistakes will be made in the financing models that we look at. And I think we need to start learning to be happier with failure so long as we learn from it. I mean, what's the alternative? If we're not sure that it's going to work in the long term, we don't do it. We've got to move.
Thank you. Okay, back to the Slido. So we've got a really good question in from Matt. He says, what type of collaboration can help address the skills gap, which is acting as a brake on decarbonisation projects? Really good question. Really difficult to get any kind of trade to do any piece of work at the moment. So how are we going to accelerate net zeros and that skills piece from our perspectives?
Can I start with a very, very quick? I've just mentioned this is a London task force on skills for a sustainable skyline. There's a stand just a couple of months back there. Go and have a look at the work they're doing. But they are working with the private sector to look at the skill, and training providers to look at the skills that are needed and to look at how they can be enhanced and developed. I'm sure everyone down this slide will have models they can tell us about.
We've actually repurposed, we're working with TfL on the site, who are one of the co-investors in the scheme. We repurposed the construction skills centre that we've had on site for the last 2 years to focus a chunk of that on green skills and training. We're working with a couple of local universities. We are working with Tech UK and Imperial, the Undaunted there. When the clean and climate tech startups come out and they want to start, most of those startups and those grow-ups actually don't know the skills that they need. So there's a gap not just in what skills are required, that we can help train them through, but they don't know, not only do they not know what skills there are, but also they don't have the people trained in those skills. So there's kind of 2 steps to it, and that's what we're working on now. So we're trying to make sure that we can do that, but also we want to trial and test new technologies, new constructions, new methodologies on site before we're actually doing the main development, development, so that we can then learn what skills are required, so we can train the local communities and upskill them in that, so that we actually have a workforce that is skilled in the new technologies, the new techniques to actually deliver that in the first place. Because the construction industry, dare I say it, is notoriously slow at responding to any new challenges, if I may be so bold.
So, as I mentioned in the start, a part of our program has been to ensure that that skills and jobs are part of the solution. The UK needs 50,000 retrofit coordinators and 400,000 trained workers. And at the moment it has 1,000 coordinators and 200,000 workers. And if we think about the fact that we'll be that gas engineers will soon be a thing of the past, they are facing a massive crisis unless they are re-skilled. So what we've done is partner with the Further Education College to create a green academy where retrofit skills can be taught, and at the same time realise that actually we've also got to help initiate that local demand, because it's all well and good saying here's the skills, and you've got to have the people that are taking it up. Now we can, in terms of our own council municipal retrofit program, we can obviously start making sure that that's a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop into that program. But also we're looking at different ways in which we can incentivize the private sector owners to actually want to engage with this. And one of the things, for instance, that we're looking at is the potential to use carbon offsetting to fund a neighbourhood retrofit grant. So it would work like a Groupon, and you'd get the neighbours to speak to neighbours and to incentivise each other, but they'd all get a discount and a grant to be able to do that, and then they would then use the local cooperative of fitters and engineers to do the work. So I think we've got to be looking at it in terms of an ecosystem. And too often you hear politicians saying, we need to get people into work, but they're not creating the jobs, or the jobs and the skills aren't there to actually get them into work. So they end up in this kind of negative feedback loop. We need to be creating positive feedback loops.
Can I just very quickly say I absolutely love that, and that's one of the things that we wanted to do, because the last thing we want to do is offset. That's the absolute bottom of our triangle, and actually if we do it, we want to make sure we spend it within the local communities to do that, and actually that's where the real offsetting can go. So I'd actually love to learn what you've done there. Sorry, Richard.
And just to reiterate the difference that we face, my boiler packed itself in over the winter. I had to replace it. I couldn't have afforded a heat pump and taking out all the microwave piping, but I pretended I could, and I tried to get an engineer to come out at least and quote me in rural Wiltshire. I couldn't get anyone to turn up to the house. My unemployment levels are frictional. We have a desperate shortage of people to fill jobs. There are so many, it's hugely different challenges. So we've got to get the nuance right between areas. But as authorities, I think what we're all doing, all of those of us who are really trying to grasp the nettle, is using our role as either a convener or a leader to kickstart. So I have the main reason that I started retrofitting Wiltshire Council housing 4 or 5 years ago now was because there is no retrofit industry in Wiltshire, and I needed to build, and the only tool I had to build it was to start with council housing. Schemes like Cllr Together, or whatever the versions that you will have running in different areas, are another way that as authorities we can say, look, here's a developer, or here's an installer of solar panels. We can't guarantee they're perfect, but they seem pretty good. The evidence is pretty good that they're there, and I still get complaints. But then use that to enable some form of capacity, some form of critical mass to build up to start the process. And even if every year you're only doing 0.5% of your housing stock, the next year is actually a bit more, and that snowball moves quite quickly. The road I live on, I reckon 10% of the houses have had solar panels put on through Cllr Together in the last couple of years, which is actually really good going. So it's finding those small levers that we can use to give consistency to the private sector to invest. The other one is skills. UK shared prosperity. I get a paltry 2 million over 3 years. I'm putting as much of that as I can into skills for various bits of decarbonisation and retrofit, because again, it's a critical shortage.
Thank you very much. So we're coming towards the end of our session, but I'm going to just do one last quick fire question to the politicians on the panel. Really good questions just come in. Given the recent flux of local councils going bankrupt, how safe do you believe local funding will be for green initiatives over the next decade? I'm going to look at my politicians. Anyone reaching for the microphone?
Well, I'm reaching for the microphone because what I would say is that that's why we need to develop new models. Clearly, lenders are not going to wish to be exposed to local authority risk, but there are ways of structuring that and having special purpose vehicles or whatever that make them bankruptcy remote from the local authorities. And what we hear from the private sector is because they know that this is a major challenge that needs to be met, they're willing to co-create models. They're willing to work they're willing to work with local authorities to look at what might happen, and we'll be certainly exploring with them how we can take that further forward.
Fantastic. Richard?
I think it's a really good point. I get a lot of council leaders and cabinet members coming up to me at various events and meetings, sort of quietly saying they have no idea how, with the state their finances were in, they can meet the pledges they've made. I would note that some of the councils that are more in control of our finances, Wiltshire is one, there are others, are those who've taken a more proactive approach and a more long-term approach to tackling these problems and are providing that consistency, because when councils look ahead, they get their finances under control. That doesn't mean that for those who are struggling, and let's be honest, half the sector at least is struggling right now, certainly half the strategic, the upper tier authorities are struggling, probably more. I think there are some really serious risks there. Fortunately, our housing revenue accounts are ring-fenced, so it's hard to... Although, having said that, there are councils running deficits in those, and that's illegal. So yeah, big risk.
Mike, I'm going to ask you just 10 seconds.
Okay, so I think we need to fundamentally change the funding framework that we are following. At the moment, we have funding pots that you have to compete for. They're very small, and they don't do the job. We need long-term funding that will enable long-term planning, which will enable proper public and private financing of these projects. Otherwise, we will never achieve net zero.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. That's the end of the session today. Thank you on behalf of the panel for giving us your afternoon, and thank you to them for coming.